Okay, so um, we know that it takes a little while for people to kind of get comfortable on their home sofas or wherever they are for an event like this. So I thought, with their pterodactyls, is it a pterodactyl?
It's a plushy velociraptor from
Oh,
Norway.
sorry. So I thought I might just ask you one or two questions just while people are coming in, Varney. So this event was supposed to happen initially, what, 6 months ago, 7 months ago?
In March, I think, however
And
long ago that was.
quite a lot has happened in that intervening time. How have things changed for you as a writer? Um,
Well, for one thing, I was locked down in Trinidad, which I hadn't been expecting. I was there as a writer in residence at the University of the West Indies, St. Augustine, for 1 month. And then the Prime Minister, who has a science background as a volcanologist with experience in disaster preparedness, naturally closed the borders. As the oddity of time began with me, not with the pandemic, but with my mother's illnesses being exacerbated around August last year.
okay.
In a way, this was just continuing from August the previous year, a sort of ribbon of Trinidad time. So it wasn't so much preventing access to resuming UK time as prolonging what was already this peculiar strand, which had its own time. It already was a kind of illness time.
Right.
And I stopped being able to hear poetry. I stopped being able to hear the rhythms of poetry, which is not really something I create so much as something I seem to listen for.
Mm.
To all apologetic if that sounds as if I'm listening for something which exists outside myself, because it feels like that. I started writing lots more nonfiction, partly because the people at the Poetry on the Move festival in Canberra had installed me online as one of 3 virtual writers in residence. And so I was asked to provide a quarantine journal entry every month. Found something interesting was happening. Well, one is that we felt very, at least my immediate family and people in my neighborhood felt, I can't speak for the whole country, though we did re-elect the Prime Minister in August when there were national elections. We felt safe, well informed, and looked after, comparatively speaking. And so I didn't have terrible surges of emotion at that time. And I wasn't visited by the desire to break quarantine and leave the house and rebel. But I was visited by the memories of places I loved very much.
Mm.
I both had immense yearning to see them again and a sense of immense good fortune at ever having seen them at all. I spent a week imagining us in Norwich Cathedral. So a lot of the quarantine diary entries have got this sort of transportation through time and place quality rather
Yeah.
than acute misery behind a plague door quality.
But that's fascinating, and maybe this is something we can come back to about the turn to nonfiction in this time, and maybe that has something. There's a relation between that and your experience of time. Um,
I
I,
think so. I mean, I think also people I've been speaking to have been writing in genres other than the ones they would consider their own.
yeah,
I've also known non-poets to start writing poetry. I don't know if it's just people have become attuned to listening differently now, or whether information is coming at us in a way that means we process differently.
right. Or have to listen differently. Yeah. I should say, for those people who are coming in now, you haven't missed anything. You haven't missed introductions. We were just beginning to talk while people got settled. So I think I will kind of introduce the evening now before Varney starts reading proper, and I hope we'll come back to some of the things that you've just started talking about. So this is the York Centre for Writing Poetry series. I'm Caleb Claces. I'm a senior lecturer at York St John. And this poetry series kind of centres BAME, queer working class writers, and we really wanted to try and foster a sense of community around poetry at York, and now happily in the non-space of the internet. We're really thrilled to have Varney today. I mean, I think Varney is one of the most significant poets working today in English. And it's really fabulous to be able to do this after such a kind of break, after her hiatus. As I say, this is supposed to be an event that happened in March, April. I'm always slightly shy of reading your latest biography, Varney, because your biography is something that shifts with the work. But I will. It's you're writer in residence at the University of York right now, the other university. There is another university in York, apparently. And your 2020 pamphlets are Odyssey Calling, which is a sad press publication exploring migration, performance, and journeys. There we go. Light Sight by Periplum, a set of expanded translations from French, and The Dusty Angel from Oystercatcher, which is a disturbing site-specific take on the literature of walking. So the way this event is going to work is Varney's going to read for about 15 minutes initially, and during that time, if you have any questions or comments or things that occur to you, please do put them in the Q&A box, because we will be then drawing on those to have a conversation after Varney's first reading. And then we will have a break, and then Varney will be joined by Rebecca Tomash, who is also a lecturer at York St John, but who will be reading from a new book called Strangers, Essays on the Human and Non-Human. And we've asked Varney to kind of think about that relationship between the human and the non-human, and kind of things, and hopefully Varney's poetry and Rebecca's prose may speak to one another. So Varney, please do go ahead, and I will disappear from the screen, I hope.
Thank you. So I think everyone has got the things I'm going to read via email and as an attachment. But if anyone would like me to screen share while I read, screen share the document, please could you put that in the chat box, because I'm aware that while in some ways Zoom is accessible, in other ways it's not accessible. And it wouldn't be at all difficult if you did want me to screen share the document. The second thing is what I'm going to read is a mix of very new and very old work, trying to find things that speak to Rebecca's vision of the interconnectedness and intimacies between the human and the non-human. I found some recurrent things, for example, stone. So my first couple of poems, I'm just going to check the chat box if anybody wants to screen share. Yes. Now, all the attendees should have got the poems as an attachment in an email, but just in case you haven't, I'm screen sharing now. And the first couple of poems are from Utter, published by P. Paltry, and I had a perspective on language when I was working at the time at the Oxford English Dictionary when I was writing this book, and I thought of language as being the sort of variegated, enormous flow, and the dictionary as not being monolithic, the dictionary consisting of lots of flickers and lots of voices and words and things and flight. And so I wrote about quite a lot of things in Utter which could look monolithic, like a church tower or a field of grass or a desert, but which really are full of beautiful variety. Monolithicity for Blowfield Church, Norfolk. Napped flint shines black, flint's kind, flint digged from gravel pits, where flint has neighboured iron may show red seepage. Flint, sourced from near the sea, is grey, like all flint. Napped, it shines black. Hand over hand over hand over 100 feet, free electronic labour placed, not meaning to expose. This basic grimness faced the rough sides with strips of napped and shining flintwork. The tower in a century neared completion. Now is the tower of 600 years ago. You could see it as one. It rocks. The bell ringers, knees overhead, scapulas overhead, all hands over ropes in the life-threatening lightning, feel this as charted color, number, sequence, as pulled peal, and in the sway of stone in wind. The tower rocks. Do you think it was meant to? While the marguerites make the white-capped ocean graveyard, meadow to mast. If you have visited or you do visit or you know Blowfield, you'll know it's one of those enormous ocean liner churches which are attached to relatively small villages or towns that seem to be floating. There is a field, moaning and matting above and below ground. Grass spreads. There is a field. There we may be together. Is it pylons buzzing, laying hexes on our nearness? Air thrums an electric abacus, invisible and spare. Flesh counters static. Fingers in their own fist, stick, spark. Tip of an index touching an earlobe hums. This is around us. There is a field. Where we may lie, grass spreads. Water resistance covers the soft of our feet, and spare water tames stalks of grain to beginning of, is it? Flooding from silted ditches, though the ground's high air thrums, for the beginnings are binding together. Stick, spark, conductivity makes us its messengers. This is the field where together we form one lie. Grass spreads like nervousness among collaborators. Air thrums, trimethylene, scent of decaying corpses, and spare product fragrance in pagan hawthorn blossom. Is it sacrificial for that reason? Smells like blood? Stick, spark, civilization, lie to one side of what? This is multiform, increasing its own distance. One grass spreads. There is a field. We may have lain together. Is it written we may not? Voltage unmetered, air thrums, works us into the land's inclination, towers, and spare rebellion, climate lost to its overcoat, stick, spark, imagining. It is not so grave. We lie. This is. Now, there was an actual field in South Oxfordshire, somewhere in the kind of Kennington, Radley, Abingdon area, where there was this electric effect with the pylons. And the smell of corpses is also true. The rest perhaps transformed. Now, the next sequence from Measures of Expatriation consists of a small set of poems in which I try to displace the I of the lyric subject with an it. And in a way, this was a trial run for my second Carcanet book, which I think was my sixth big fat book. And so it was a trial run for Venus as a Bear, in which is everything is all about itness, with just a few little its. Inhuman Triumphs for Nicholas Laughlin. 1. The poet transformed into a box hedge. It was a small snail on a rainy day. It was a small snail. A petal vertex. It was a small snail nestled ascendant the heart of a rose, an apricot rose. And for a small snail on a rainy day, the sea was beating about my heart. Oh, love, beating about my green heart of hearts. 2. The poet transformed into a double vodka. Accuse me before I start of seeking forms to shatter, at the icy least to overspill. You meantime pouring out me on the rocks. Man drinks mermaid, mistaking her for liquor. Seizing my mirror, make up wars for islands that aren't cold. You grin, I chill, water wins my heart, an alien drop in my interior, and into whom am melting, a cubic volume of undrunk spirit. Oh, love, wrapped in glass, wrapped in a set of bony fingers. Air, how does it transpire that we are from each other? 3. The poet transformed into a heat haze. And it was not a hot country, but occasionally hot, though not by decree nor description, even a day like this where it rained fiercely on sheets of sun, jubilant about heat, but denying hotness, not a hot country. And it drove the insects in droves. It drove drivers off roads, drove drivers into whatever grows on the sides of roads. And roads became what happened to be passing by, because I melted them. And beggars died too shy to beg for drinks, because it's stupid to feel the heat, admit to feeling the heat, and to not liking it, and not to liking it, but to feeling everything twice as thick, feeling at all. The stream sucked it up, milled on wordless. The trees rebelled. Oh, love, voted with their roots, forgetting how to vote, vowing their all to, as a leaf, double, shape, shade, light, a stitch up. 4. The poet transformed into a piece of painted fabric. That night laid hands on my back, ironing out a castle, finding no body is true. That night's pursuit turned up a green sleeve flat as a wall. That's true as well. Sky and I locked eyes. Who called curtains first? No journalism could tell. Shall this poem turn to the wrong side? Fine seam of gold stripes me. Righteous buyers mutter, mind. Mine, I said tonight. And oh, love, night kept going round in circles, trailing a moonless shower, lurid threads. 5. The poet transformed into space. Oh, love. The next couple of things I'll read are very, very new, among the new things I've written since I've not been writing as much poetry this year. And there's an associated photometry site with images by Andre Bagou, the wonderful poet, published variously by Peopletree and at Jasmine. And I really commend that site to you, which Andre did do during the plague, more or less. And he took photographs of ordinary things around his house. Sorry, this is reminding me there's something I'll always listen to, which isn't me, unfortunately for me, and I hope fortunately for you, I'm listening to me instead. But yes, so Andre took photographs of objects around his house and made them luminous and geometrical. Alliterative diamond. Quand j'étais plus jeune, j'avais des réserves lumineuses. When I was young, when younger, I had light stockpiled, step wells of luminosity, seams of gleaming, inward glow, brightness had my back, hot buttresses, radiant underpinnings, unreserved reservoirs. My fashion walked sunrays, failings wheeled to sunrise. Doing was floating, dear and perpetual, shining went into me, should not go out. Look, we have resources. My life, you have my light. UNESCO perpetual. Il suffit de savoir bien regarder, il faut voir. C'est admirable. N'importe quoi est merveille. Tout est une épiphanie glorieuse. Le moindre objet resplendit. Set out for the horizon. Only pack miracles, mirrors and miracles. Saline vigils may ebb and flow, so that evenings fan out in laughter, send me night music via paper boats. The beam of a lighthouse decommissioned long ago in a world all aglow, Stevenson's on. Eternity's doing us a favor, see? C'est joy to the hall, whole, moon, lemon, monk, monkey, citrus, parrot, tattooist, flute player, nenufar, water lily, Luriot, testimony, surge, fill, fold, foal, lone, digit, minim, any and every forlorn and delightsome, what more? The least little thing is a splendor. Now, I may not read all of the ones in this section. I'm trying to keep it to 15 minutes so we have a chance to pick things up from the Q&A and there'll be more of a chance to interact with Rebecca. But in keeping with the idea of dwelling with and things or letting oneself be inhabited by a sense of their itness and loving them for that, I'm going to read a few poems from a sequence about glass from Venus as a Bear. And I did think there's a particular reason I dedicated this to Helen MacDonald, whom I've met a few times, but she was being very nice to me at this point, when I think I was being unsettled in Cambridge, which is a familiar situation for many unsettled in Cambridge. The glass slows in the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, sadly mostly now not on display, 18th century, a lot of it made in Newcastle, and actually a lot of it made by women in Newcastle, who were great glassmakers. Through and through, l'attimo, l'attimo, milk twist, mist hint, Venetians pearled minerals, lead, lime, tin lime, thicked clear-glassed quasi-Chinese porcelain for simple painting, birds and flowers, fingers twirl composite stems whose color twist rock candies, snake ladders, precious yellow, less rare green, bird claw red, while blue, longed for, yearns like a certainty expressed by convolution, but inwardly a wind of truth. Contemplate, for a moment, l'attimo, how just as when in calmo joins bubbles blown separately, two, while hot, made one. Each listed item here desires liquid, lips, lights fronted below looped eyes. 2. The Chomsky bequest towards a grammar from 18th century glass. And as most of you will know, this is a riff on colorless green ideas sleep furiously, but some of you may not yet have encountered that wonderful sentence. So I'll just quote it also because I love it. Opaque twist rival stems home super subtly, clarion teardrop minnows spiral heavily, strokable dancing ponds recline pastorally, expensive delicate kundalinis amaze unironically, triple annular knops preside reticently, borderline armed arches lull ruinously, diamond point square afterthoughts quaff piratically, milky skippy vignettes land militantly, flammable wheeling sisters grave triumphantly, colorless green ideals double readily, Rich, fragile blues yellow desirably. Convex, concave shapes flow transparently, substantially, between pure and empty, between thine and thee. And I am not reading this one, fortunately, because it's sort of impossible to read, and it does exist as a shape. And the glass had been displayed in a cabinet, which was a glass cabinet with glass shelves, on the landing of the high staircase in the Atmolian Museum, opposite high windows of slightly patterned glass, so there's multiple refraction going on. And I'll just let that sit there. Over to you, Caleb. Rebecca, chat box.
Hello. Thank you so much for that, Vani. I'll let people kind of digest that and just give people a moment to write anything more into the chat box. But there's an initial poem here which relates to another one that another student asked me to ask, which is about process. So the question is, how many drafts or rewrites does a poem take? And do you find it's the same process, or do different poems have different processes?
Different poems have different processes. And I'm sorry, Holly, I just saw that note about increasing the magnification. I'm very sorry about that. And you should have, if anyone wants to look back, you should have the readings as a file attached to the email that you'll have received with confirmation of the event. So
Okay. There are
drafting
links.
and process. Sometimes I hear poems which seem to come out all in one. And sometimes writing one poem seems to dislodge others that were queued up and waiting to be written. So it's not uncommon that if I do one, I'll do 4 in a day. And if I've been having a sort of precarious and itinerant life, which is often the case, sometimes I can store up quite a lot of poems and poem shapes in my head. And I remember once landing up on Rebecca Barr's sofa in Galway, and she gave me a polka dot blanket and a cup of tea and left me and went into the city centre. When she came back, I hadn't changed position, had drunk the tea and drafted 11 poems, which I've been thinking about over the last few weeks, but I hadn't had a moment of peace and quiet before. Something that happens which is odd is sometimes when I look back, I can see the germ of much later poems in much earlier ones, which is why I'm really enjoying getting older. So there's a little germ even in the Inhuman Triumphs, which would have been written at some point 2015, 2016. In the Ice Cube Vodka one, which I don't particularly enjoy and don't like reading, but I read it still because it's part of the set. There's a little germ of the preoccupation with the Odyssey, which then turned into Odyssey Calling in 2019 to 20. And another thing is sometimes I see a poem as a visual object. Other times I have a kind of embodied and conceptual feeling of being among a kind of poemness. And then there's an intersemiotic feeling, I don't know by what means, to translate that feeling or something like it to a reader. And in that case, the drafts sometimes don't resemble one another formally at all. But that's very different from the poem that arrives in words or arrives as an argument to a series of rhythms. The one that has that 4-dimensionality and kinetic spinning quality to it is quite hard to convey. And one might look tight and one draft might look spread out.
Right. And is that there's another question from Emily, but I wanted to just jump in there and ask about in the emphasis on Skin Can Hold on performance and maybe embodied activity, and does that follow on from what you've been saying there about how some poems come in that form or want to have that form, or was that more of a kind of conscious move away from writing on the page?
Well, I think it was a different thing altogether. But when I was talking about the drafting, I was thinking about the poems I write as an individual, with a sense of sending them out into a world of mostly unknown readers. And Skin Can Hold was to do with altering the moment of reading a text and also what reading might mean. Because I often had the great pleasure and terrifying experience of having my idea of what a text was or could be completely broken open, just reading it with someone, reading it aloud, or trying to translate it into movements. And so I wanted to do a book which would both record some of what happened, say when we were looking at Martin Carter's Guyanese, the Guyanese revolutionary poet Martin Carter's poems, and how those moved differently as we did different things with them. So I wanted to record how that happened, but then also write texts which readers could take away and do things with and do things collaboratively. So that was different because the previous one was the drafting of a poem that is an I, which is myself, trying to relate to an it, and then trying to send that out in the world in a sort of message in a bottle way.
Yeah.
And the other one is the experience of reading being collaborative and external as well as internal, and then the experience of writing for that kind of shared space and reimagining. You said there was another question, Caleb, did you?
Yeah, so there are a couple of questions, and I think both of them relate to rules. I think, I mean, both in terms of rules of writing, maybe rules of practice. Do you feel like you follow rules in writing? I suppose in any of the kind of aspects of your practice.
Okay, I think you'll answer this in 5 brief points.
Okay.
And the first one is that I rarely am driven to read and listen to other people a lot. And so what I would say is that the first point, that reading is where one deduces the rules. So the second point is that even if you haven't been aware of deducing rules, and even if you don't read much poetry, you'll have picked up an idea of what is a poem-ish thing. So even if you imagine you're writing freely, you're not. So the third point is to be conscious of not being in control, which isn't to say just to sort of wallow or to say that I'm spoken by this or that, but to let myself try to live out a certain energy of inhabitation and movement and almost transcription or intersemiotic translation when I'm in that moment of conceiving a poem and trying to convey it into a form. I try not to be self-conscious then, and control belongs with self-consciousness. But then in the editing phase, which is the fourth point, I try to go back and be very suspicious. The last point, the fifth point, very suspicious about have I absorbed other forms consciously or unconsciously, or what's the best thing, what's the best framework, are there techniques? The fifth is really that form can be a lot of fun. I haven't played a lot of computer games. I have done things like martial arts and dancing really badly, but it can be fun to follow patterns and improvise with patterns. And so rather than thinking in terms of control or models or communication, it can be worth thinking in terms of interactivity and pleasure.
Yes. And I think that relates to another question. We have 2 more questions here, both which are very interesting. One is just what writers do you read, write, and think with? And I suppose that's kind of perhaps right now, and that relates to what you're saying about maybe opening yourself up to other writers. Yeah.
I spend a lot of time wandering around vacantly. I often think that I don't have any thoughts at all. It's true, though. I sometimes think that if I were to write a proper bio, it wouldn't say right in residence at the University of York, contributing editor peer review. It would say wanders around vacantly, does not notice mud. I realize that what that really means is, one, there's some part of me that I'm not aware of, which can get quite saturated with sounds and speech and all the discourse that is around us. And so it's processing that. And another thing that isn't attuned into those forms of poetry which seem external to me, whether you think they are or not, it's how it seems to me. I need vast amount of silence. And in terms of the writers, I think I'll answer that briefly in 3 points. One is, while you were very kind, Caleb, in introducing me as a significant writer in English, I do think that there's so many people writing well now. As I said to Will Harris before his prize win, as I said to Will Harris within the last 2 weeks before his prize win, I'd be quite happy to die, or not to write anything again. My work is done. I can be let off. There's so many good books of poetry. Point is that these are piling up by the kilogram and by the cubic foot in my flat, and I want to read them, but I can't actually read them all, but I do try to read some of them. The second thing is that if I teach or mentor or talk to other people with whom there's a dynamic or motivated reason to talk, not a meandering conversation about poetry, but you have booked into my office over 30 minutes, or you are, editing this towards the final draft for a collection or whatever, then I find that the people in those positions often have been reading a fantastic and interesting variety of things. Patrick Errington, who is supposedly my mentee for the Scottish Book Trust and is an extremely advanced thinker, has been recommending books in metaphor. The third point would be, they're the books by all the fantastic new writers. They're the books recommended by friends, students, mentees, whatever. But the third thing not to lose sight of, which I often lose sight of, is the core of one's own research. So when to that silence, the silence also produces a reading list. And it produces weird intuitions, tropisms, and attractions. And at the moment, I'm silently reading reflexively about silence.
That links very nicely to the next question, actually, which I'll just read word for word. It says, I feel bathed in sound when I hear/read your poems. It's a deeply immersive feeling. Where do you think your voice comes from, please?
Thank you. That's a very kind remark. I think that sounds as if it comes from an excellent reader, because not everyone allows the oral quality and the temporality to poetry. And forgive me if I've said this before, but I will never really tire of saying it. But one of the things I learned from Dante when I read the Commedia, which I made the effort to read in Italian, should I rather say Tuscan, one of the things I learned is that he creates soundscapes and he keeps cueing you into them, and then he also tells you when sounds are taken off. So you know when the rustling or the crying or the shrieking or the music or whatever has come on and what qualities it has. And then he expects you, your part of the bargain is to go on imagining that soundscape until he turns it off and he says it's gone off. I think that we're not as good as medieval readers at being able to do that. I also don't think I have a unitary voice, but it'll come both from listening to silence and probably from my former training as a medievalist, where because you know that people are distant from you in time and culture, these dead people who are your friends, then you have to make a greater effort to be in dialogue with them.
Do you hear the voice of Dante? I mean, what does that sound like?
No, I haven't heard the voice of Dante as much. I had the feeling of Dante once or twice when I was on the Ponte Vecchio, and there's a swirl of people going back and forth at snatches of conversation and people holding on to each other. Of course, this was pre-pandemic, and in fact, it's probably before a few of the listeners were born. And it was true, though. But I had that feeling of the swirl of voices as being a bit like the Inferno and some of the Purgatorio. And of course, Paradiso is the most fun. With that, you hear the music of the spheres, which is so good that you pass out. So really the voice I hear most clearly is that of St. Augustine.
Why is that?
Extraordinary speaking voice. I mean, I had a peculiar experience where I had been reading him in the morning in Stansted Airport before getting back to my final home here in Edinburgh. And his speaking voice from just reading him was resonating so strongly in my head that I was still hearing his phrases while they were calling out the flight safety measures. And unfortunately, I had been reading what you're saying about the Book of Job, and it wasn't a comfortable combination.
And perhaps finally for this segment, which is again opposite, given that you've been talking about journeys and airports, what was your journey into becoming a poet?
I tend to answer that in different ways over time because I don't understand it myself. I used to say that it was because my father was a poet and writing poetry was normal. Then I used to say it's because my mother used to read and sing to me in a number of languages. But I'm also starting to wonder if there were also negative aspects. So in some ways I had an emotionally neglected childhood. And then although I had an excellent education at St. Joseph's Convent, Port of Spain, I was often at odds with the laywoman teachers, though the nuns were great friends. And so I often had terrible fights with the teachers and would walk out of school. So I don't know whether it's that thing of being in one's head. And then there's a post-colonial situation of being forced to imagine, because the things you see around you are not depicted in literature.
Mm.
You read, even if it's from other parts of the global south, it's not a place you know. So we had to read Chinua Achebe, but I still haven't been to Nigeria. An effort of the imagination. So I don't know if that being forced to keep bridging between bodily experience and the internal imaginative experience was something for me. I know that, for example, Rosemary Sutcliffe talks about illness, doesn't she? About illness and isolation and
Right.
hearing, Roman soldiers and whatnot when she wrote her children's books. I think quite a lot of writers have these sort of tunnels or corridors as treatment and bridging.
What you say about schooling comes into Skink and Hold. That kind of school place is partly in the Martin Carter section, isn't it?
Yes, that's right. So part of this was to do with the difficulty of recreating the context, because the people I was working with, Paige Smeaton, Hope Doherty, Olivia Scott-Berry, Jeremy Hardingham, and others who I'm probably leaving out and going to hit myself about after. I didn't say that. But they came from a variety of backgrounds and experiences, but we knew that the audience who turned up at the Faculty of English in Cambridge wouldn't necessarily have done background reading in Guyana or have visited Guyana.
Mm.
There's the mixture of conservative formal education and of the consciousness in Carter of all the buried voices, the tongueless whispering in the land. So first of all, the indigenous people, and then of course, the people brought over, the African slaves, and then of course, the ones brought over under Indian indentureship, who, as Gayatri Bahadur has charted in Coolie Woman, also included people displaced within India, even from Afghanistan. So how is it possible to talk about this layering of history within the land and the sort of box or cadre of a very formal conservative education? Then how is it possible to talk about nationalism and communism and anti-colonialism and independence as all related to each other in Martin Carter's work? Where here nationalism means about throwing other people out, but in Guyana nationalism meant wanting to be recognized as basically human. So the word itself has a different valency. So we decided to have more than one person trying to present the same poem over and over. And one person was the school teacher trying to teach a textbook conservative formal version of Martin Carter in a classroom. And what that helped with was there was a motivated reason within the drama to convey a lot of basic facts the audience would have known. But then not noticing, as authorities often don't notice, that he didn't have two normal students, he had two unruly, rebellious mimes who end up by throwing over the classroom and doing their own improvisations in kata. And I turned into a wandering preacher who had memorized a very long poem by Carter and went around reciting it madly. And then there's also Barbed Wire, which of course deals with the violence of internal and external rail barriers, which continue to this day, not just in terms of migration, but in terms of trade barriers and then the barriers between the perception of one person's humanity and another. So we had Barbed Wire with protest poems stuck up on it, which recalls the incident in the life of Martin Carter when he painted poems on his house fence. He hung poems from his house fence because he was under surveillance. So the surveillance photographer would be forced to record his work.
Mm.
So what we did was represent the poem over and over in all these ways.
Mm.
It accessible by some kind of sexy one-shot performance, make it accessible by refracting it, and then we all had a cosmic dance at the end, because the poem is about an astronomer of freedom, ultimately.
Yeah. Wow. Thank you. I think we'll end there for this section, and we will take a brief comfort break and return at what is it, 1847, so 7 o'clock, I think. If that makes sense to you, Vani?
Yes, and I do encourage people to bring their drinks, snacks, and companion animals.
Yes, exactly. And just to reiterate, if the email that you received with your login details for the event should have a link to both what Rebecca will read and what Vani's been reading, if you would like to get that up on your own computers. So we will reconvene with snacks, etc. At 7 o'clock. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Hello again, Vani.
Hi.
Did you get some? Oh, and hello, Rebecca.
Hi.
Very nice to be joined by you. Did you both get some snacks and some water?
I did not get snacks, but I have my tea.
Oh yeah, your suspicious tea.
Yes, let's not talk about that. Not in an illegal way.
So in this section, we will hear from both of you, and then we'll have the same format. So please do, if you get a chance as you're listening or towards the end of the reading, please do put more questions into the Q&A, and we will ask them at the end. So Vani, would you like to go first? And then we will hear from Rebecca.
Yes, I'll change plan very slightly and just read 3 poems, the 3 final ones I think you have in your document from The Dusty Angel. And this is so we have more time to talk to each other and also to hear from Rebecca. These are the very newest things I've written, and I think that the reason I could write them when I wasn't normally writing poetry is that the whole project had begun last year, and so it was carrying on with its own momentum, which is a pre-pandemic momentum. So at first, you see, it was that I was walking with my friend Judy Raymond around Queen's Park Savannah in Port of Spain in Trinidad, which is the central green space, and sometimes would go up the hill, Lady Chancellor Hill. But the sort of peril in that, supposedly, is that there are murders and there are abductions, possibly for the organ trade, possibly for the sex trade, probably linked to the cocaine trade, poverty, desperation, who knows, gender violence. But it's true that there are a lot of murders and abductions, and many, many people have exaggerated how dangerous it is. And so people stopped using the green spaces as much. And Judy and I insisted on walking them and even enjoying walking them. They're very odd things. They're colonial houses along there, and old graveyards, and escapes from the gardens, suddenly beautiful flowering shrubs hanging off precipices. So these are from some of those walks. They continued whenever lockdown allowed, lockdown restrictions eased slightly. They continued during the pandemic, those walks. And during one of them, I looked down from the hill towards the port and the harbour. It was as if I could see the thing that happens in the last poem here. Let me just see. Is there something in the chat about the screen share? Or is it just, oh, no, it's a different question for later, fine. I hope that this magnification is okay for everyone. From The Dusty Angel, walk number 4. But look, we have a tree wrapped red and silver, like a solo sweet drink. But look, we have trees lit green and silver, like a 7-Up. Christmas, fits of deranged birds. Old houses whisper. I wish you would kiss me as much as you like, says Millefleur, unhappy behind galvanize. Returns the air. I wish you would kiss me much more. Cassia fiddle-de-dees. Lost horses, harlequinade lost racetracks. A plane crashes without sound in the experimental past. The tramline was busy. Schoolgirls dressed like milk must not go out in the rain. Has it been raining? Mindless caroling could be an ordinary mode. Oxygenated like a chorister, having slept in Excelsis, walk on like mud, holding you in consciousness of trenches of the buried, excavated, reburied locals, once beheaded to be examples, now under buildings that dominate photographs. A bed is a lit space. A lit space is not a bed. Men startle, running chunkily, trees gardent beside. Let them eat your dust, women of silver, running like hurtless light. I should say that this mashes up time, so it's a kind of deep time of one place. So there was a tram line, and if you know to look for it, you can see the traces of it on the perimeter of the savannah. Otherwise, you would just notice a sort of double avenue of trees. There used to be a race course. I remember seeing the horses there when I was 7. There isn't any longer. Millefleur is a beautiful, romantic, French-style mansion built by the Venezuelan Mr. Prada for his wife, whom he loved very dearly. You could see how he loved her because it's such a sweet and graceful sort of house. It's like handing her a bouquet of flowers, except in marble and metal and wood. And then the excavations were real. People keep digging things up that they don't know what to do with, and then often they just put them back in. Sometimes First Nations things, sometimes other things. Walk number 5. Yellow and black and pale and hectic red, cling and fall, satin rags from cliffside trees, each like a corpse within its grave until, wrested into resurrection, wrestling angels of rain and lightning, they are spread nets of wildfire on the charcoal hill of vapors from whose solid atmosphere time can't break to run forwards or backwards. Quivering within the waves' intenser day, the same striders from changing directions. Heavy weight of hours has chained and bowed. They pass more often than is possible, and by the incantation of this verse, slot into standstill near the waterfall. Be through my lips to unawakened earth, magenta petals and an emerald bird. O wind, the trumpet of a prophecy isn't required. Just to bring our seasons home. The 3 footnotes on that, the italicized bits are from obviously Ode to the West Wind, and the form is a riff on the form called A Coupling, devised by Karen McCarthy Wolf, whose poetry I can't recommend enough, it's very good. And the third thing is, on one of these walks, the air was very, very still, peculiarly still. And my friend Judy and I kept on seeing people who looked like the people who'd already gone up the hill, going up the hill again, or would see them coming down the hill twice. And there seemed to be either a lot of people who looked similar or a time slip going on. It unnerved Judy a bit more than it unnerved me, I think. It could just have been people who looked like each other. Walk number 6. Oil painting of itself. This shocking dullness, known to be Sea Harbor blue. Paint by numbers. Sahara dust dumps pink on ochre, fullness of allergens. Who breathes in these streets? Cumbered with a bad job, looking down at his bare feet, the shamed outsize angel shakes dust off his heels, his tunic purple, his task to spread new plague. Walk as if your knees are lifting higher, though it's a gift box shelved inside your chest that smallens breathing, makes lungs toil, fit friends crest eased corners, red rocks share away, desiring handholds from abseiling vines, so little slows erosion from extraordinary flows. Hidden water added to explicit rain. Blue is both an expectation and a thirst during this climb, not in the sky, glossy rare police cars midnight past, a cobalt cyclist, wildflowers blue in manuals, in truth they're lilac. What buildings have those roofs? Where in Port of Spain? The Gulf of Paria is sundown ready all day, promise of a bluer depth. The wind blows as he goes about the city. There's no fixing his hair. Brightness thickens. People fall. He leans in. Light falls from the air. Thank you.
And now we turn to Rebecca. Sorry, I still was muted.
No worries. Hi, everyone. It's such a pleasure to be the support act for Varney. My name is Dr. Rebecca Tomash. I am lecturer in creative writing here at York St John, and I co-organise the York Centre for Writing Poetry series with Caleb, who is your host tonight. And I just want to second Caleb's thanks for Varney sharing their amazing work with us as part of this event. I have chosen an essay from my new book, which I feel like hopefully has some resonance with the work that Varney is sharing tonight. The collection is called Strangers, Essays on the Human and the Non-Human. It's published by Makina Books. It came out this month. And the kind of focus of the collection is on the connections that we as human beings have with the non-human world. And it's about the kind of strange intimacy that we share with difference. And it's also about this moment of climate crisis, ecological grief and ecological collapse. But it also has some looser themes that connect with things that Varney was talking about, this idea of being, itness, an openness to possibility and the strange. So I'm going to read the entirety of this essay because it's a short one, and you were sent the text of this essay in your confirmation email. So if you want to kind of read along as I'm reading, feel free. On mystery. I will always go to the fun fair when it comes into town, and walk amongst the burger wrappers and fizzy sweets and Wurlitzers and clashing music. Occasionally a friend will agree to go on some rides with me and will scream until the air is glittered and swimming. The feeling of entering a fun fair is the feeling of utter inconsolable mystery. For a long time I've thought about what meaning I can ascribe to the hugeness of the feeling there. The sun going down as the rainbow-coloured lights splash over the heath. The unsettling mixture of innocence and sex, where little children scream and play at the same time that teenagers gather to smoke and kiss and be sick. On the edges of the fun fair, are small dwellings, caravans and tents, white and blue washing hanging outside, leather boots. These are the normal everyday things of the people who work for the fun fair, but the fun fair transforms them like a trick mirror, turning them strange, making them secrete mystery like phosphorescence. Circus feeling goes everywhere in which mystery dips into view. Seeing different stars every few days does not mean that you have always a good life. It cannot just solve your problems. Yet walking past a poster for one at the seaside, my partner says, "We can't let you go to that, you'd run away." He can see the vulgar, tender sparkling behind my eyelids. At a circus in Budapest when I was very young, I saw lions and a real Indian elephant. I knew that I was being serviced with a brutality I couldn't get at home. I wondered whether Aztec citizens, watching sacrificial victims have their hearts cut out hundreds of years ago, felt any less terror or disgust than I might feel if I saw the same thing. Circus feeling is saturated with meaning, but the meaning is unspeakable. I find myself wanting to write that feeling, that feeling, that feeling over and over again as language pleasurably fails. As a child, I was terrified of ghosts. It didn't matter that there were real dangers out in the world, perverts, murderers, thieves. Every night I would lie choked in fear, listening for the smallest noise, knowing that this would be the moment when I would open my eyes and see one in front of me. The moment when I finally rid myself of terror was not the moment I stopped believing in them. Rather, it occurred to me to ask myself what they would do to me. They might murder me, torture me, abduct me, maim me, make me go insane. Nothing they were capable of doing was any different to what a human might inflict if they decided to do it. I had genuinely never thought beyond the moment of unspeakable terror and unknowing, where the veil would be rent and I would see something. I did not actually know what. Imagining them cutting me into little pieces was awful, but without real mystery. If they wanted to kill me, I might not know the reason, but there would be one somewhere. A plan, a rationale, cruelty or sacrifice or pleasure, some sordid but nameable thing. So I was free. Mystery is in the tapes my father gave me of Transylvanian Roma music. The squall of the violins and the soaring voices is, in a quite literal sense, irresistible. I don't think you could walk in a forest and see a huge snake rise up in front of you and feel nothing. Similarly, I don't think you can hear this music and feel nothing. It is sophisticated, brilliantly put together, and wild. Where does the mystery come from? It is the music of no rulers. When I first heard someone use gypsy as an insult as a child, I was completely shocked. To me, to be a gypsy was the highest form imaginable for a human being. To keep moving, to parlay your own destiny out to the rattling of horses' hooves, to head off to unknown places. A closeted, privileged view of what is valued. In W.G. Sebald's Austerlitz, the title character remembers coming upon a ramshackle circus troupe playing for a tiny audience behind the Gare d'Austerlitz. "I still do not understand," said Austerlitz, "what was happening within me as I listened to this extraordinarily foreign nocturnal music conjured out of thin air, so to speak, by the circus performers with their slightly out-of-tune instruments. Nor could I have said at the time whether my heart was contracting in pain or expanding with happiness for the first time in my life. But today, looking back, it seems to me as if the mystery which touched me at the time was summed up in the image of the snow-white goose standing motionless and steadfast among the musicians as long as they played, beneath that shimmering firmament of painted stars until the last notes had died away, as if it knew its own future and the fate of its present companions." Walking through fields in Sussex in high winds, trees moving, grass moving, air moving, white trainers getting black with mud, whistling turbulent birdsong. My body clenched with the feeling that I am not the only one out there. Something is moving through the green, not over it, but in it. Something is moving towards me and away from me at the same time, through the swirling blue patterns in the wheat, in the swirling patterns around them. I recount this experience to a family member who I always considered to be rational, organised, sharp. Without looking up from cutting some bread, she says, "I suppose you felt Pan moving out there." I immediately burst into tears. The softness and sentimentality of my reaction to this describes perfectly my biggest obstacle in talking to you, in really talking to you. Pan has long been referred to as the god heard but not seen. This comes from the strange music he plays, panpipes calling in the distance, underneath the sound of rainfall. The ancient Greek playwright Euripides wrote the Bacchae, a play which focuses on another wild god, Dionysus. In the play, King Pentheus of Thebes rejects the god and refuses to worship him, despite the fact that his power is demonstrated by the women of the city turning to the wild hills to dance and sing in constant ecstatic worship of Dionysus. Pentheus ignores all warnings, bans the women's celebrations, and captures Dionysus, who, being a god, easily escapes and razes the palace to the ground. Excuse me. Deeply attracted by the Maenads who he claims to be repulsed by, and overcome by his enemy's casual destruction of all that he holds dear, he sneaks off to observe the women. Caught in an ecstatic, altered state, his own mother, Agave, murders him, thinking he is a mountain lion. She is then sent into exile, whilst other family members are turned into snakes. By the end, even Dionysus's worshippers, the Bacchantes, feel bad for the harsh treatment meted out to those who refuse to give in to mystery. They want pity, but the play is not interested in pity or mercy or cruelty. And this is a quote from the play. Knowledge is not wisdom, cleverness is not without awareness of our death, not without recalling just how brief our flare is. He who overreaches will, in his overreaching, lose what he possesses, betray what he has now. That which is beyond us, which is greater than the human, the unattainably great, is for the mad, or for those who listen to the mad, and then believe them. That's the end of the quote. Everywhere I go, it seems like all the warnings and all the metaphors have already been written and are waiting patiently for us to read them. Thank you.
Thank you, Rebecca. I'm hoping, hello, Varney. So there's one question here, and I hope people will ask more if they would like to. But just as a starter, somebody's asked about writing exercises that you would recommend, both of you. And I suppose, I don't know if it is possible to tailor that to thinking about what you've both been reading about or partly reading about, which is a kind of engagement with the non-human. So yeah, writing exercises, recommendations.
Want to go first, Varney?
Well, Varney, I think...
Yeah, sorry, no, I think probably you know more about this than I do, Rebecca, and I'm not joking. Well, the first thing I thought of was something to do with the Bacchae, which was a writing exercise, but I'd like to hear you talk about real ones.
I mean, it's an interesting one because I think writing exercises are something which I kind of often give as advice to students, but it's usually drawn from kind of what it is that they particularly need at that particular moment. I think that I personally don't use writing exercises anymore because I don't know really. I mean, it's an interesting question. I suppose I kind of have got out of the habit, but I do think that there is some value to them. I mean, it's not exactly a writing exercise, but something that I do think is a kind of helpful, more general exercise to do, perhaps if you're feeling a little bit stuck or you're kind of looking to kind of do something a bit different, is to do a version of ekphrasis, which, you know, traditionally is a kind of poetic response to art or visual art. But I think that can be true for really any genre that isn't literature, to try and respond in language to a non sort of language dominated art form, be that visual art, be that music, even film, which is obviously very kind of image dominated, or photography. I find that trying to write something that responds or has a conversation with a sort of non-language form can be an incredibly helpful way of getting ideas. It can be a really helpful way of also kind of discovering what it is that you actually want to express and what it is that language can do that other art forms can't. And I think sort of mulling over those questions and experimenting with those questions is a really helpful poetic practice.
Varney, did you want to expand on Bacchus?
Well, a little bit on the Bacchae rather. And I spent about 2 years doing processional theatre versions of the Bacchae, and I stopped in the end because very strange events started happening during these performances and rehearsals. And I'll just say as a footnote to that, that my friend Liz Irwin, the classicist, explained to me ages ago that the moment of transformation in the Bacchae, which is most striking, occurs when Pentheus is nagging the god Dionysos, his cousin, to tell him what the women are really up to in the mountain. And Dionysos says, "Do you want to hear things that are bitter to you?" And Pentheus says, "Yes, just tell me." And then the god doesn't say anything. He just says, "Ah," and he breathes. In that moment of wordless breathing, Pentheus, his cousin, is internally transformed. So Dionysos acts as a god in that silent moment of exhalation that creates an interior transformation in Pentheus, who then says, dress me, I want to be like one of the most beautiful of Cadmus's daughters. You put ribbons in my hair, I want to go among the women, I want to be like one of the women on the mountain and take part in the rites. So from being a very uptight young man following the rule of law by the letter, he suddenly wants to be a bacchante. And what I find interesting about that is not just the wordlessness, but that when the god gets into his mind, he transforms him by the way of deformation. So he deforms Pentheus's self-relation, and he puts him in the position of fragmentation and vulnerability. So he doesn't it's not actually an ecstatic transgender experience which he accesses. He fails at being anything. So when he lets the god breathe into him, he loses himself and gains nothing else. His mother looks at him, sees a mountain lion, and rips the mountain lion's head off. So he's neither the woman he wants to be, nor the beast his mother sees, nor the king, nor a son, nor a god's cousin. And so what was very interesting was, as preparation for this processional theatre of the Bacchae, I took a copy with the ancient Greek and English parallel text up the sacred mountain of Tamana in Trinidad, because another friend of mine, the fiction writer Sharon Millar, Millar, said that it really matters to sweat together, to be thinking about a text, and to sweat together and be bodily present, and to take that text into a different place. So the exercise I would recommend is that you take the text you're reading into a different place. And I know that's quite difficult during the pandemic, and it's also potentially against the common good if you go around breathing on people these days. But a different place could just mean with your back to the window or facing the window. It could mean, you change the light bulb from a green one to an orange one. You can make place different in all sorts of ways, even without leaving your room. So when we went up the sacred mountain of Tamana, which is sacred to the indigenous people, there was an odd moment when Judy, the same friend from the walks, who knows classical Greek very well, was reading part of the Bacchae in ancient Greek. And suddenly the indigenous guide who was with us said very sharply, "Do you have alcohol with you? Are you drinking?" And he was quite angry about that to go to the sacred mountain. He said, "I can smell pure alcohol." And this is very weird because we were sitting very high up the mountain by a cave of bats on some banana leaves that he'd cut to make a seat for us, some banana leaves on some branches. I couldn't smell anything except, the things you smell in a forest, certainly not pure alcohol. So I'd say, yes, take texts into different places, but also be careful how you play with them. So the exercise is twofold. One, the physical place where you are and how you share a text is going to affect how you work with it. Two, be quite careful in the boundaries you put around that work, because if you're opening yourself up to an experiential listening, which is a method I've been recommending, you can't just ask anything in. I'm sorry if that sounds weird, but the indigenous guide smelling the pure alcohol was the least of numerous weird events. Rehearsals.
so that relates to another question we've had about the relationship between the personal and everything else in both of your writings. Specifically, both of you place yourself into writing. How do you approach writing about personal subjects or memories? Rebecca, how would you respond to that in terms of the essays?
Yes. Yeah, because there's a couple of questions about that, aren't there? I think it's an interesting one. I mean, for me, writing these essays, which are obviously non-fiction, I think what kind of came first was the more kind of political and kind of intellectual ideas that I wanted to explore. I kind of knew quite clearly the sort of ecological crises that I wanted to think about, the questions of kind of equality and how that sits alongside sort of human equality and how that sits alongside non-human equality as well. But as I kind of wrote them, it was just inevitable to me that I would kind of draw on personal experience, because I think, you know, there is no impersonal way, I think, of kind of interrogating sort of ecological questions, because they have import for everything about the ways in which we live, but also the ways that we kind of feel and think. And I think part of what my essays are talking about is this idea that the very nature of our thinking is shaped by our relationship with the non-human world. So for me, it was kind of tangled up and unavoidable to reflect on those questions. But I also think that, I mean, I think someone in the questions asked, you know, is it different to how you might kind of write fiction? And I don't know, because I don't write fiction and I never have, but I think that there is that similar desire that I assume fiction writers have, which is to kind of draw the reader in, and also to make ideas which are quite sort of many layered and complicated, you know, accessible and kind of open, and to kind of to put on an equal playing field emotion, sensuality, bodily experience, and intellectual experience. You know, for me, those are both forms of knowing, which are both crucial. And so to tie in the personal and the sort of political and social and intellectual is a kind of inevitable follow-on from that attitude.
Varney, I think there's a question that perhaps is more towards you, but somebody's asking about why we're perhaps drawn to the classics. After all, we have all the content in the world to reference or write about. What is it about the classics that we're drawn back to?
I'd say that there were three reasons, really, and also I'm not sure that all of us are drawn to reference the classics. In fact, I've retracted a work in progress which was continuing to reference the classics. They've retracted that for reasons which are too long to go into here. But one depressingly is colonial education, because despite the links of ancient Greece with Africa, with India, etc., ancient Greece was appropriated by the British as somehow a forerunner of the civilization that they supposedly were spreading. And so it's much easier for me to get a parallel text translation of Euripides' Bacchae, ancient Greek and English, than it would be for me to get a parallel text translation of something from one of the numerous other traditions, too numerous for me to name. So that's the depressing answer. The second answer would be because I won't make it into three. I make too many things into three. I'll just the second answer, which is there's a simple workable machine I found when I was dealing with Greek drama, which you can adapt with little resources, or you can enrich with multiple resources. They're extremely playable plays, and they deal with extremes and the little things of everyday life in a way which feels true. Whereas quite a lot of poetry that wants to do well, to not, not upset the audience, not to get a bad review, please the judges or whatever, it wouldn't take those risks. You wouldn't have the little things of everyday life, plus the gross extremes of murder, incest, and rape, even though that's what life is like.
Mm.
So there's more truth. I think there's more unashamed starkness of truth in terms of the content that is compounded.
Yeah. And does that chime with your experience, Rebecca?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's such a, as Vani says, that sense of extremity, but the idea of extremity as truth, that actually these are kind of the things which we do confront. And, you know, as you say, the mixture of normality and kind of cruelty and that I think is very true. And I think we, you know, obviously can't just make sweeping generalizations about 2000 years of culture, but more. But, you know, I think there is a risk taking and a lack of kind of fear of having to be palatable, which makes Greek drama so powerful. And I think about something like Antigone. If you think about this idea of a character who is prepared to basically overthrow themselves, destroy themselves, and overthrow their society just because of this sense of needing to kind of do justice to their family member and needing to kind of put their family member in the earth because her brother is you know, not allowed to be buried, and she's about to kind of sacrifice everything to bury him. That sense of the kind of internal rightness and how that can sometimes kind of go against the strictures of the world, I think that's ever relevant and ever important. So that really speaks to me as well.
And perhaps sticking with you, Rebecca, there's another question here about what you term as the non-human, how you might go about defining the non-human.
So this will be a really boring answer, because I literally just mean anything which isn't human, like, you know, and the reason that I like that phrase is because it's so capacious. It includes, you know, sort of living beings, but also even potentially kind of non-living objects, if you want it to. It has that capacious quality. And the other reason that I like it is that I kind of use it instead of saying nature or the natural world. And the reason that I don't like using those terms is that it suggests a division, that we are outside of the natural world, that we are not part of nature as human beings, whereas of course we are. That doesn't mean that we're identical to other sort of non-human creatures, and it doesn't mean that we have some kind of sort of holistic reality, but I think it's dangerous for us to try and act as if we are somehow above or separate from the world in which we live and which we are a part of and which we are kind of connected to. So of course non-human has a kind of, you know, it is a separation word, but I think it's one which has a lot more space in it and a lot more room to breathe, and I find it much more useful when we are thinking most specifically about kind of environmental and ecological questions in poetry and in non-fiction.
I think that's a really fascinating answer, Rebecca, both in the sense of interconnectedness of things. But I've noticed when people talk about nature, how quickly nature becomes a grammatical object of a sentence, and we X, Y, or Z, you know, must save or deform, or we fail to appreciate, or something or the other, this object, nature. So to talk about the non-human, apart from the interconnectedness, which is absolutely crucial for us to apprehend, the thing that follows is that when you talk about the non-human, it's so vast that it's obvious you're not trying to define it. And therefore that throws the onus back on us to reconsider what we mean when we say human.
I completely agree. And I think it's exactly that capaciousness, which, as you say, reminds us that we can't contain that world in a phrase, and that actually we have to go back to specifics, and that there is no kind of simple comprehension of what nature is, but also of any individual non-human being, which we love to kind of clump together as kind of often sort of sentimental symbols rather than kind of realities of their own. So yeah, I completely agree.
I think there are a few more questions.
There are. I was just kind of reading through to see if we can synthesize it all. I mean, I think there's a really interesting question about the way that ideas are presented, and perhaps this is an interesting thing about writing non-fiction and writing poetry. The question is, when trying to share your thematic ideas in a multi-layered way or through metaphor, how do you trust that your messages will be interpreted in the way that you would want them to? Is there a risk that the reader won't get it? I mean, that's an interesting, I mean, that sort of makes some assumptions about the kind of transmission of a message, which is kind of interesting. I think Varney, how would you respond to that?
I'd say that first off, I wouldn't want to predetermine who any reader is, and therefore they're both entitled to find my work trivial or something. I don't know in what situation they're reading it. They might be reading it in a hospital, and they're entitled to throw it across the room and get absolutely nothing from it. On the other hand, I sometimes get things from poems that I'm fairly sure that the poet wouldn't have intended. And therefore, what I would tend to do is try to step back behind that question and not to be trendy, but in truth to separate what the author believes to be his, her, their, its intention from what the work itself does. And I'm going to reference St. Augustine in order to talk about God, which, as I found out, or repeatedly find out, means some people stop thinking when they hear that word. So don't stop thinking, but it kind of relates to some of the things we were talking about earlier. Because St. Augustine was talking about in what way, in his belief, humanity is created in God's image. And to him, it was clear that this must be in terms of the resemblance in the mind being created in the image, and that therefore the mind was unknowable by itself, just as God is unknowable to us in our mortal state. And so I find that's very interesting, because he uses his framework to gesture at the unknowability, gesture towards the unknowability of the mind, and therefore we contain and potentially can express that which is beyond us. So that's why I really feel that I have to do my best according to my own lights, but also know that whatever I've done is from a mind that's unknowable to me, and it's going to have effects that are beyond what I can perceive. I'm honestly not too bothered, also because I never know if anything's going to be reviewed.
Thank you. Rebecca, was it different writing essays, or your relationship to an imagined reader or readers, or that kind of space of reception?
Yeah, I mean, I think it was very different. I mean, I think I agree with Varney in the sense that, you know, part of what's exciting about putting something into the world in whatever form is the unexpected element. You certainly don't want to have a kind of pre-baked concept of exactly what the experience will be for each reader, partly because of course every reader is different, but also because you hope that there's kind of space in that work for people to take their own journeys through. But I do think that there is a stark difference for me between poetry and nonfiction, and I think that is because in the case of this book, I did have quite a clear idea of what I wanted to say, not a rigid idea, obviously, you know, it's quite a poetic, whatever that means, you know, book of nonfiction, but I did have some quite clear kind of subjects that I wanted to address, I suppose, and because of that, I didn't really feel that I could express it in poetry in quite the way that I wanted to, because for me, poetry is just always about questioning. It's always about asking questions and kind of opening up spaces for potential, both for the writer and for the reader. And I think that's still true of prose, but a little bit less true in nonfiction. And so that slightly in some ways reduced a more specific space is one that I kind of wanted to enter with nonfiction. And I, you know, they're both meaningful in different ways. But there are things that I kind of want to at least put on the table for the reader and ask them to consider. And it's a little bit easier to do that in nonfiction, and it suits it better, I think. I wouldn't want to do that in a poem.
Okay, thank you. So there are two. Oh, there's another one. There were two questions. One about how you identify work you're going to reference. How do you kind of seek out new work? Do you identify this work in advance or stumble across it in the process of writing? And then another one, which may be close to our final one, which is about just do you have any tips on getting things out into the world? But firstly, how do you identify which work you're going to reference? How do you find work? I think Varney touched on this in the first half, so maybe Rebecca, how do you kind of go, how do you form your reading? Where does it come from?
Yeah, I mean, I think for this nonfiction, I barely sort of discovered anything as I was going along. I think by the time the writing came about, that was the end of the process rather than the beginning. I'd already, I did a PhD in which I sort of partly considered kind of ecological writing and this sort of thing. So it's sort of been a reading process of, well, many years, but 6-7 years of kind of intense sort of interaction with these themes. And of course, I bring in a lot of stuff that isn't overtly environmental. But so I already kind of had all of these interests. But then when I actually kind of sat down to write each individual essay, then I would think, what feels relevant here? What do I want to kind of talk about? That's going to be a kind of meaningful conversation. And then all of those works that already kind of meant something to me sort of arrived at the table and we shared a conversation. So for me, the reading is what gets me to the writing. Actually, that's the kind of groundwork that I need to do. And then, when the writing process arrives, I already kind of have my material that I want to draw on. And for me, that's the most satisfying way, but I really don't think there's a right way to do it at all. That's just what kind of suited me as a practitioner. I don't know how Varney finds it.
I think I touched on it a bit earlier, as you say, Caleb, and I don't want to talk too much at this point. So we have got a few unanswered questions. I would say what's important to me, identifying what writing impulse I have. And so if it's an impulse to engage with a pre-existing work, then I want to do a reading around that. And I think everyone needs to do that as part of decolonization. We really need to know that we do not know, and there will be lands of knowledge which are relevant to any subject, which other people will know better than we do. And we needn't expect them to do the labor of all of us informing us. We need to go and seek, especially where we feel we know. We need to realize there'll be more that we don't know. So that's identifying if I've got, say, a reviewing or academic impulse. Other times there's a more introspective impulse, and that's when I have to go into silence or go into my own mind. And as you say, Rebecca, previous reading will start to clump or to come to the table.
And there's I suppose a comment here which is about decentering the human. So we kind of going back to some of the earlier conversations. Where is the human? Is the human at the center necessarily because of language, or is it possible to place humans somewhere else? Rebecca.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's no point pretending that the human isn't at the center of our perspective, of, whether that's our ideology or our society or whatever it might be. So I don't have a problem with the non-human because it reflects the reality of where we're starting from. I really am suspect of environmental nature type work, which thinks that it can, in a flash, remove the human perspective and create a kind of immediate objectivity. I think it's quite politically dangerous because it suggests that somehow if we just decide to get rid of the human, we can suddenly just kind of commune with the non-human, we can interpret it and we can communicate it to other human beings, which I think is just another kind of project of control, but sometimes with very good intentions. So I think, but at the same time, I also think it is really important to decenter the human. Okay, so what I mean by those two kind of contradictions is, I think that trying to decenter ourselves is a practice and a process. It's never an event. We have to constantly lead ourselves away from our own kind of sort of conceptual strictures and to go towards the non-human, but recognize we'll never fully reach it. But the more that we get into that practice, the more we might hope to kind of have a crack in our own kind of overwhelming subjectivity and be able to kind of grow a more equitable and a more kind of open relationship with what we are already very intimate with, which is this very different and very strange, but sort of equally valuable kind of non-human life that's out there. So I think we definitely need to try and decenter, but also not get too kind of cocky about maybe what we can achieve in a kind of immediate moment.
Yeah, because I mean, as a species, it's often cited that we are better than other species because we evolved tools or live in cities or whatever. And increasingly, I think that shows that we're worse than other species. Other species haven't evolved habitats which destroy other habitats to the extent that we do.
Right.
So basically almost everything that is pointed at technologically as something that proves we're great, those that know we're dubiously interventionist. And so I think being aware of the scale of intervention that one species can provoke is incredibly important to keep in sight. And part of that does involve the kind of humility, the practice of humility you mentioned, Rebecca, vis-a-vis other things, and trying to have a relational sense of the human towards other things. And to be truly relational means a constant decentering and recentering, rather than ever feeling we've arrived or we've dissolved. But I do think, though, and I'm not going to dwell on this, that the question seemed as much to be about terminology, because I think the person was asking whether we're having human and non-human, you entering human in a way, but I don't think that's necessarily an effect of that language.
It's tricky.
It is.
So there are two last questions. So one, I think, expands on something we've talked about before, which is how precious or proprietorial do you feel about your work? And I think both of you have spoken about that. And then the final one is, do you have any tips for us all on getting things out there into the world, both in terms of poetry and non-fiction?
I feel like Varney will have a more interesting response to this, so I'll just give my banal response. I think that, I mean, God, this is probably so brutally obvious, but I think that it's partly about developing a reading practice of kind of places that you would like to eventually be. I think it can, and that sounds really obvious, but actually I think it can really take time to kind of find the homes for literature that actually really kind of speak to you as a writer, literary journals, online journals, all these kind of places. Allow yourself that time to actually discover kind of where it is that really sort of excites and inspires you, and those are the places to kind of begin sending your work to. And apologies if that is obvious, but I think a kind of scattershot approach is totally fine. There's nothing wrong with it, but you will have much more luck sending work to places where you already kind of feel that you have an affinity with, and I think that's a really good process. And the other thing is, as much as you can, develop a community. I think for all the kind of difficulties that come with the internet age, or that come with the kind of hyper fast capitalist world that we live in, there is the opportunity to connect in many, many different ways, whether it's face to face or not. And I think often, certainly for me, it's through those communities of fellow writers and friends who I've worked with and who have supported me that I've been able to get my work into the world. It's never felt like a kind of solo mission. So if you don't have that community, doing what you can, it's not always easy, to find and build one is probably the most fruitful thing that you could aim for.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is a really good answer, and I don't have much to add. I just would really like to expand a little bit on that idea of community, and whether it's under the rubric of the digital age or interconnectedness or decolonization or whatever, it's important to remember that your kindred spirits might not be geographically or linguistically near you. Keep a good eye out on translation, for translation and exchange programs, or journals in other regions and territories who might have broadly thematic or formal interests aligned with your own, or complementary interesting ways to your own. The second thing, and I have to say something dark and difficult, otherwise it wouldn't really be me, I think sometimes that's what I'm hired to do, is to be careful about community, because I've seen it happening and I've had it almost happen to me, that a powerful, apparently beneficent figure will take you up, and often of, I don't want to say the opposite sex, because I mean, I've seen it happen. I've often seen it happen with powerful older men and younger women, but I'm sure it also happens with kind of introverted persons assigned male at birth, and people who are extroverted and of any gender. But it happens that you get taken up and sort of groomed and given a position, and then you start to either become a cult figure because they don't really want you to succeed, or you start to reproduce their feuds for them, or you replicate their style and become a strange sort of carbon copy of them. So seek community widely and be careful of friends who are excessively helpful.
Agreed.
Thank you. Thank you both so much for reading and for discussing those questions so openly. And thank you to everyone who's been here silently and on text. And please look out for future, almost certainly digital events from the York Centre for Writing. So thank you. Thanks very much. Okay. Bye-bye.
Thank you all. Thank you, Varney.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rebecca. Thank you, Caleb. Thank you, everyone.